Hello and welcome back. Today I want to ask and answer the question, should we love ourselves? Is that a biblical concept? Today we're looking at the 7th sermon in Jonathan Edwards' series of sermons, Charity and Its Fruits. And the title of this text is that charity is contrary to a selfish spirit, so we shouldn't have a selfish spirit. And Edwards is looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5. Seeketh not her own. Charity seeketh not her own. And again, we come now to this question: should we seek our own? Should we mainly seek our own, or should we love ourselves? This is a question that sometimes comes up, and you may be surprised to know that Edwards thinks that we actually should love ourselves. He believes, honestly, that loving ourselves is something that is legitimate. It is legitimate to love yourself in this sense. The Bible says that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. So if we are to love our neighbor like we love ourselves, the Bible then seems to assume that we will love ourselves. One of the things, though, that the problem with loving ourselves is that we seem to mainly love ourselves. When Edwards talks about then how we ought to love, he argues that before sin came into the world, before the fall, there was a love that we had for God. There was a love that we had for holiness, there was a love we had for others, and there was a love we had for ourselves. All of these would all have been present. And in the fall, those first three, love for God, love for holiness, love for others, they all seemed to collapse. And the only one left was love for self. And so the problem is not that you love yourself. The problem is that you only love yourself. You're supposed to love God and others and love holiness. And if all of those are in place, then living for yourself is entirely appropriate. We may want to think about this in this way. Imagine a man comes home from work, and each night, all that he does is thinks about what he wants and moves after what he wants and doesn't care about what anybody else wants. And we might say, well, this wouldn't be a very nice man to live with. He's just always thinking about himself and wanting everybody else to just organize their life in a way that makes him happy. But imagine this man in time begins to think, I ought to think about what my kids care about. I should want my kids to be happy. And he begins to work towards his children being happy. And in time, he begins to think, well, my wife, I should also think about her. And so he begins to think about his wife. And let's just say he also thinks about his neighbors. I haven't been a very good neighbor. And he begins to think about his neighbors. And so we see then this man, he doesn't stop loving himself, but he begins to love his children, his wife, his neighbor. And in these ways, he's applying what we would say are biblical principles that you ought to care about others. And yet, even now, we are not at a distinctively Christian way of loving, because a distinctive way of loving would basically also recognize that we are to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. So for this improvement in this man to become truly Christian, he must love God more than his neighbor, his wife, his children, and even himself. And so Edwards, what he's getting at here is that we ought to have all of those loves, and yet there is one love that is king. It is love for God. And if we love God the most, and we love others as we should, we can continue, and we ought to continue to love ourselves, to love our happiness. But if we're the sort of person who only cares about our own happiness and only cares about ourselves to the neglect of everyone else, including God, then we have a problem, and we have our loves out of order. So there's a proportion here. There's a proportion that the one who should be loved the most is God, and then also a proportion that doesn't have you loving yourself as outweighing your love for others, but in correct proportion. One of the things then that we need to just say before we finish up here is that this love then will find its joy in God. If God is the greatest love there, God is the greatest being, then you, even in seeking your own love and you loving yourself, and in that way what we sort of mean is that you're trying to work toward your own happiness, you recognize that your happiness is best found in you enjoying God. And you having communion with God, and you having fellowship with God, and you longing after God and spending time with God, and in you living for the glory of God, not for your own glory. And so this is also what Edwards means when he says, well, you have to You have to love yourself in a sense properly, but that is to love yourself by finding your joy in the greatest being, in God himself. And if you find your joy, if you love yourself in a sense by loving God the most and finding all your joy and delight in him, then you will in fact be loving properly, loving the way that God means for you to. And so you work toward this loving God and enjoying God and having fellowship with God. You work for that for yourself. And as a matter of fact, that's what you're working for your wife and your children and your neighbor. You want them not to be happy by ignoring God, but you want them to be happy in their own enjoyment of God. And so we are God-centered in this. We're finding our joy in God. And yet, if we love God the most and we're working toward our joy in the Lord, and we're working toward our neighbor's joy in the Lord and our family's joy in the Lord, we will find that it is perfectly appropriate for us to love ourselves by finding our joy in God and our neighbor's joy in God. And we can, in fact, love ourselves. We don't need to squash love for self, but we need to think of it properly and biblically. And in this way, we honor God and bring glory to him.